I remember another drug epidemic that began in the 1980s. Back then, we weren't so sensitive about what we called people who used crack cocaine. Families were torn apart at that time too. Lives were cut short, and a wealth of potential was lost on a generation of African American youths. But no one seemed to care about those urban crackheads. Unlike the heroin addicts today creating this opioid epidemic, which has had a disproportionate impact on white suburbanites and rural areas, black crack addicts were dispensable. To many politicians, they even belonged in jail. So in 1986, Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, establishing, for the first time, mandatory minimum sentences for those convicted of having specific amounts of cocaine. The sentences were much tougher for crack cocaine than powder cocaine cases, which disproportionately affected African Americans. Now, even tough on crime Republicans are pushing for a more sympathetic approach to handling those with drug addiction, highlighted by President Donald Trump's recent executive action. In the 1980s, instead of pouring resources into counseling and other forms of treatment, America chose to clamp down on crime. Officials thought they could simply arrest their way out of the crack cocaine crisis and it would just go away. In the end, that approach has had as much as an adverse impact on African American families as the crack did. Hundreds of thousands of African Americans across the country ended up with prison records because of minor drug violations, a legacy that continues to contribute to the decay of poor urban communities. That was a bad decision, and not just for the black communities devastated by crack addiction. It was also a missed opportunity for policymakers to figure out how to best fight a drug crisis that sooner or later was bound to leave the ghettos and wind up where more affluent people live. 30 years ago, someone should have realized it was only a matter of time before some illegal substance, whether crack or heroin or methamphetamine, would find its way to mainstream America. No particular group of people is immune to drug abuse. While environment often plays a role in addiction, this latest crisis has taught us that poverty isn't the only factor. Addiction has no racial or economic boundaries. So if America had shown less contempt and more compassion for crack addicts, we'd be so far ahead of the game now in dealing with this crazy opioid addiction. If crack addiction had been treated like a national crisis rather than a neighborhood vice, we'd have a better understanding today of how drugs spread through populations. We would know more about which treatments work and why some have a longer impact than others. Perhaps we might have even developed scientific methods that would prevent drug addiction in the first place. Who knows what we could have come up with as a nation if we had put our heads together. Instead, we threw away that opportunity and now we're starting from scratch. White suburbanites are lobbying their state officials to help them solve a problem that is ruining young people's lives, and rightly so. They're holding rallies on state house lawns, urging elected officials to treat their addicted children with dignity, something that young people addicted to crack never received. State legislators, governors, members of Congress, even the president are paying attention. The recent New Jersey governor, Chris Christie, who led a White House commission focused on addressing opioid addiction, issued a report to Congress that gives us some insight into why this particular epidemic is so urgent. Officials must address this, he said, to awaken every American to this simple fact. If this scourge has not found you or your family yet, without bold action by everyone, it soon will. Too bad it only took 3 decades to realize that.